possibly the next most awesome video game of 1990 is a game that wasn't actually made in 1990, but it found its way to the United States in 1990, so that's where all of us experienced it for the first time, and that is Final Fantasy. I was never a big Final Fantasy kid growing up, but it was nevertheless revered.
Yeah, it changed my life. It was so important for me.
Wow.
It was the first RPG I ever played. So Dragon Warrior had been out. Nintendo was really trying to push Dragon Warrior, which was Dragon Quest I. But it just was a real. That game, was made in the mid '80s, '86. Final Fantasy was an iteration on that, and taking it and trying to make that a better game.
It was sort of a knockoff.
It was a knockoff. I mean, it was made by Square before Square was Square Enix.
Yeah.
And Square was struggling at the time too. They had made a couple NES games. This funny shooter called King's Knight, where you're a knight in like a fantasy zone, but you're just shooting stuff. It's really funny. And then they made Rad Racer, which was pretty popular. But they were tanking before Final Fantasy came out. That's why they called it Final Fantasy. They thought it would be their final game. But yeah, it was like Dragon Quest, but it was made later, so it was an improvement on it. You could choose your character and name your characters, which is really neat, because Erlich is the star of Dragon Quest. There's like character backstories and stuff, but you could also have a class, and that was all really interesting. But for me, it was a game about what does this mean when I'm walking around a map and there's monsters and numbers on the screen? That was all so new and strange. I didn't play D&D. I was 9 years old. I had no idea. So I had to learn everything about RPGs by Final Fantasy teaching me it, and it was a terrible teacher.
It's weirdly mathy and hard to understand
it's
for children.
Really hard to understand. My biggest stumbling stone, I remember getting the game, and I was so excited because I was excited it was a big game. And in fact, I had the Nintendo Power Strategy Guide, and I was just flipping through, and it's like, how could a game be this big for the same amount of money as Ninja Gaiden 2? That doesn't make any sense to me. So I was like, what value? That's what I was thinking as a kid. I don't know why.
Sam needed to get the most from
playing that up, the biggest game ever. But yeah, I remember getting it and buying weapons and having gold to buy weapons, and I was like, okay. And then I ventured forth, and I was just getting creamed still. And I was like, what's going on? Because you had to equip them. And just learning what equip was. That is beyond complicated for a Nintendo game from 1990, let alone when it was actually developed.
Is it fair to say that Final Fantasy is largely responsible for popularizing the RPG genre on a console?
It was so much more popular than Dragon Quest.
PCs had certainly had plenty of them by then, but yeah, on
really
a home console.
It brought RPGs home, and for somebody that I mean, RPGs were kind of adult games on PC. I just wouldn't have come in contact with them.
Right.
So the fact that Nintendo brought it over, put a lot behind it. I mean, they really promoted it a lot. Made a huge difference, and it sold really well in the United States too.
No chocobos back in the original; those guys were
around
later.
And no Sid. There's nothing to tie Final Fantasy in with the other series, except for the most important thing, which is the airship. And in that game, you have such a massive world, and you can walk. And when you're walking, there's certain enemies. But if you get a ship, you can cross the oceans, and there's different enemies. If you get an airship, you can just avoid all that stuff. Just go wherever you want. And that opens up 70% of the game. You can just go places and land there, and you'll be overpowered. And I've talked about this in other shows, but I love that feeling when you have finally the world opens up, and you're like, I'm gonna risk this. I'm gonna go somewhere where I should. Maybe buy something that's really expensive. Because and that's another thing. I had to learn how to grind in that game.
Yeah.
You couldn't beat anything unless you just went around and fought these giants outside the elf town forever. It was so worth it to buy some silver stuff. I can tell you guys never did that, but it's worth it.
I was actually playing East Book 1 and 2 on the TurboGrafx while Final Fantasy was going on. It's sort of two different approaches at the same thing.
You owned a TurboGrafx?
I did.
That's awesome.
You were the guy.
That was my first 16-bit system, even though it wasn't technically 16-bit. But
I grew up in Arizona as well. I never even saw one growing up.
Yeah.
I think I saw them in a rental store, but I never knew anybody.
Well, my friend Robert, who ties into one of our other topics later, bizarrely,
classic Robert.
He was sort of his parents definitely had a little more money, and they got him the TurboGrafx CD, and so that's how I played East Book 1 and 2, because it was the CD-ROM game.
And if you had a Master System, you'd play Phantasy Star.
That is true.
So there's a big RPG in each system. And then there wasn't another Final Fantasy for a long time because they skipped all of them, and then by 4 they made that into 2 here. But yeah, Final Fantasy 1. That's my favorite Final Fantasy.
Really?
I played a lot of Final Fantasies. I just think it's a funny but really intense, like almost arcadey RPG game.
Sure, yeah.
It's just different.
It sheds a lot of the stuff that Final Fantasy relies on now too, which is like big sweeping stories, lots and lots of dialogue. And it is really just the heart of what makes those games
yeah,
good.
it's almost an action RPG in the sense that it doesn't have story, but it's still
originally called Fighting Fantasy, not inaccurately.
Yeah.
So.
And you know what else is cool about it? You choose your classes, but if you choose the really lame classes, like Red Wizard or Thief or Black Belt, they become awesome because later you graduate and you change class, and all your little characters actually get twice as high, and they look badass. And then they have a different thing. So like I think the Thief is the one that becomes the ninja, which is like really strange.
Seems like a natural progression.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can believe that.
I might be wrong on that, but there's also a black belt, but I think that becomes the master. So it's very strange, but they can start, like characters that are just fighters can start using magic, for instance. And you just have so many more permutations you can do them. And of course there's infinite replay because you can play through as all white mages if you'd like, and have no attack power whatsoever and just heal, and it's a completely different game. It's really funny.
Speak.